In the good old summertime, in the good old summertime.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Golden Age of Cricket podcast, a show to highlight the many fascinating players and matches from the period immediately prior to the outbreak of the First World War. My name is Tom Ford. Today's episode is slightly different to those previous in that we're not focusing on a single player, rather we're going to look at a particular series, one which took place in the English summer of 1912. Staged just a few weeks after the sinking of the Titanic, for historical reference, the Triangular Tournament of 1912 was the first of its kind, a series in which three cricket nations, England, Australia and South Africa, battled it out across 9 test matches. What sounded progressive and lucrative in theory turned out to be a disaster for the administrators, with poor weather, small crowds, and absent high-profile players contributing to its doomed status. But more than a century later, how are we to view this tournament and what lessons, if any, were learned? To help us better understand the tournament, I welcome back to the podcast Patrick Ferriday, who was a previous guest in a discussion on the subject of Wilfred Rhodes. In 2010, Patrick wrote a highly praised account of the tournament titled Before the Lights Went Out, the 1912 Triangular Tournament, and I'm thrilled he's with us today. Patrick, hello and welcome back.
Thank you very much, Tom. You've summarised that series very well. You've rather stolen my thunder, but there you
Well, let's wrap it up there then. Let's call it a day.
go.
No, there's much to discuss, and I'm sure many of my listeners know a bit about the 1912 series already. But having read your book, I realized that there's a lot to it. There's a lot of background and obviously ramifications from the tournament. In fact, one of the better things, and there's a number of great things about your book, but one of the better things was how you went into the background of each of these cricketing entities back into the 19th century, the status of English cricket in the 19th century, and the same for Australia and South Africa. How much did you already know going into the research, or was this a huge learning experience for you?
I knew a fair bit about it, to be honest. But I did have to look at it quite closely. I knew kind of what I was looking for. The idea really was to see how the three countries got to 1912 in terms of Test cricket, the development of Test cricket. It's probably the England-Australia part is better known, starting with Grace and the tours back and forwards and money making. The England, South Africa, and certainly Australia, South Africa was a little bit more obscure, not very obscure, but and it seemed logical to work back from 1912 to see how they'd arrived at what was the first triangular tournament and last. Well, until recent times. In a sense, I slightly regret doing that. It made the book slightly overlong, in my opinion, and I perhaps should have concentrated a bit more on the 1912 series itself. But I suppose a lot of people reading it will be quite into their cricket, especially at this time or of that time, and they'll probably know a lot of that stuff as well. But for the ones who didn't, then I think it was a decent summary. It's not an in-depth study of England versus Australia or Australia versus South Africa, but it's enough to sort of put you in the mood to how it got to where it was at that time. And also because the last 5 or 6 years, once they'd started trying to organize this damn thing, it required the ability to look back and see the points they were arguing over, particularly things like how the Australian team made money, which eventually was, of course, came to blows, as you well know, and involved the 6 of the best Australian players not coming because the money wasn't available. I'm sure we'll go into that a bit later. Um, yeah, it was context, it was background, and yeah, I did a fair bit of work on it, but I did know a fair bit about it as well. But it was very nice, dotting I's and crossing T's and getting it clear in my own mind as well.
Yeah, no, I very much enjoyed it. I think it was necessary, but I was in the camp, perhaps like some of my listeners, where sure, the English and Australian stuff was more familiar to me, but the South African stuff was illuminating. And I think it was absolutely necessary before we understood how the tournament came to be, that we understood where South African cricket stood in the 19th century. So I applaud you for that because I think it was very much needed for the context of the book.
Yeah, I mean, Australia and South Africa weren't particularly keen on playing one another, really, to be honest. The Australians, because they thought they were better than the South Africans, and they were, um, and also because there wasn't any much money to be made from it. So they only met for the first time in, I think it was 1902, when the Australian team were on their way back from the English tour. So they stopped off in South Africa for 6 weeks or something, played 3 test matches, beat South Africa, probably not as easily as they thought they would do, but played on matting wickets as well.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
and then they didn't play again for 10 years or something. And then the 1910-11 series was the next one. First time South Africa had played in Australia. So yeah, there was no huge appetite for it. Um, but it was kind of pushed together in a sense. I think everybody wanted or liked the idea that there are 3 test nations rather than 2, which had been the case before.
Mm.
It's a shame that South Africa weren't as good as the other 2.
Yeah, and naturally, the Australians wanted to play England in England because that's where the money was to be made. And for the
Exactly.
previous 3 decades, they made basically a year's salary or more just from this, few-month journey on gate receipts. But we'll talk a bit more about that later. Let's talk about the actual tournament itself and the idea of it. Is it fair to say that it was largely the idea of one man, Abe Bailey? What can you tell us about Abe and his relationship to cricket?
Sir Abe Bailey, as he later became, he was a South African businessman, I suppose. It's a bit hard to find out exactly. I mean, he was involved in mining, which pretty much everybody in South Africa who had a lot of money was involved in diamond or gold mining. Had a lot of property interests, and he was fantastically rich, and he did love cricket, and he did play. He played first class cricket, not at not hugely successfully, but well enough. But what he did do was throw his money around, and he threw it at making South Africa a competitive cricketing nation, which was pretty tough because basically in South Africa, I suppose you could split the South African population at that time into 3 different groups. There was the indigenous black population, there was the English, and then there was the Dutch, or the Dutch or the Afrikaans. Well, the black population weren't interested in cricket. Um, the Dutch population wasn't interested in cricket, which left just the English, and that was a very, very small percentage of the population. Um, but he did his best. He chucked money around. He um, employed any number of private secretaries who he got from England, who all happened to be first class cricketers, Reggie Schwartz and Frank Mitchell and any number of others. And yeah, he bankrolled international South African cricket for many years. He loved it. I don't think he expected any returns on it. And his dream really was this triangular tournament because it would see South Africa playing on a level field with Australia and England, and would somehow make the three of them the powers in cricket, which South Africa were definitely the poor cousin of the three, but he hoped putting the three together, and I think he was given a certain amount of confidence or optimism, in the sense that in 1905, 1906, South Africa did have a pretty good team. They had a lot of good leg break bowlers. They had four leg break bowlers, three of whom were very good. Um, and they thumped England on matting wickets in 19. This is 5-6. I think it was 1956. Um, and did very well in England in 1907 on turf wickets and wet turf wickets, and proved that they were, a force to be reckoned with. Um, I think that made Bailey think that it was possible that the three could compete on a fairly even basis, but unfortunately the tournament took so long to organise. By the time it eventually came round, that group of South African players were either not as good as they were or had retired altogether. So when it came to it, this excellent team of 1906 wasn't really in existence anymore, which was a bit of a shame.
Yes, because initially it was the 1909 summer, I believe, that everyone was pushing for. But of course, that had already been arranged for the Australians to go to England. And the Australians naturally said, no, we don't want to share the gate receipts with anyone. So that pushed it back. And they had some support from Stanley Jackson, I believe, who was saying, why are we rushing this idea? Let's get it right. So it naturally was pushed back. But as you say, that affected perhaps the performance of the South Africans, who were coming into their prime just a few years before that. And we'll touch on their form a bit later. Just on Abe Bailey, Patrick. So it sounds like we can credit him with the rise of South African cricket in the late 19th century, early 20th. I mean, he threw his money around, sure, but he is credited with this sort of emergence of South African cricket on the world stage.
Yeah, I think money was obviously the main part of it, but he did have a lot of connections in England
Mm.
with MCC, and he used those connections, and he gave them to believe that he could push this thing forward, and that if South Africa came to England, they wouldn't necessarily need to draw big crowds or require reimbursement of any significant amount, because he would just fill the shortfall, which he also did for the 1912 series as far as the South African team was concerned. He used his connections, he used his money, he used his influence, and cricket really was his sort of abiding passion, probably along with making money, and horse racing. He did love his horse
Ah.
racing as well.
Mm. So this idea of the tournament is planted in people's minds at the turn of the century, and it starts to gain momentum in those early years of the 20th century. One of the more outspoken supporters or champions of the tournament was C.B. Fry, obviously very well known international cricketer, one of the great first class batsman of the late 19th, early 20th centuries. He appears, for having read your book, he seems to have seen the tournament as a way, or really as a vessel, to further British imperialism. Was Fry's belief in the tournament as transparent as that, or were there other, perhaps more personal reasons why he was a champion of the tournament?
Well, you'd have to ask him.
He's
um,
unavailable.
he's unavailable. Yes, he was a champion of it, but he certainly wasn't the only one. Stanley Jackson was as well. I would think, probably, from what I know of Fry, probably he had an idea that this would be a sort of uh, a crowning peak of his career if he could captain England in the first triangular tournament, which he eventually went on to do. But I think you've hit on a very, very important part um, of the entire project, was the increasing of imperial ties. And that's something I do go into quite a lot in the book, and I don't regret that at all, because the more I look at it, the more I think that a significant part of the move towards playing this tournament was off the field. You'd have to go back to where, particularly where Britain was at that stage, around 1905, 1906. They were facing increasing pressure from Germany in a military sense, and in a technological sense, and an industrial sense. And what I think I hadn't realized when I started writing the book was how early people, a lot of influential people, thought that war was inevitable with Germany, not just possible, not even likely, actually inevitable. I was astonished when I read I think it was in 1911, a Times leader that just talked about when war happens, not if, but when. And I hadn't realized that 3 years before the First World War started, that the Times could be talking about when we fight Germany.
Yes.
Um, Now, I think that gave impetus to particularly a lot of people who were keen on this tournament anyway, because if Britain was going to fight Germany, well, the only countries it could rely on to help were the colonies, as they were called, and South Africa and Australia were and Canada were the most significant of those colonies, and it was absolutely without any question at all. I mean, I've got a number of quotes in here, which I'll try and find one or two of them. Um, these people knew what they were doing, and they talked about. I'll try and find one or two. They talked about, strengthening colonial ties and for the battle that ahead. I think the best one, I put them right at the start of the book. Best one was from Lord Hawke, who said, on the cricket grounds of the Empire is fostered the spirit of never knowing when you are beaten, of playing for your side and not yourself, and of never giving up a game as lost. This is as invaluable in imperial matters as in cricket. And then Abe Bailey himself says, other colonies will be deeply interested in these matches. I'm hopeful that the contemporary cricketers and those who figure in Empire cricket in years to come will agree that the triangular tests of 1912 were not held in vain. It was very much pull the Empire together, because the Empire, or the queen bee in the Empire might be under threat, and the busy worker bees better get ready and to defend her. I don't really like describing South Africa and Australia as busy worker
Mm,
bees around, but I mean, to a degree, in 19 at that time, to a degree that was the case. Um,
mm.
and it's a really significant part of why this tournament finally got off the ground. Um, there was pressure from politicians. Certainly, the big lords, Hawke and Harris and so on, really got on board with it. And various cricketers such as Jessup had military connections. And when I read the Times saying when the war starts, that's when I realised that actually a lot more people than I had ever figured knew that this war was coming. It wasn't like suddenly in the summer of 1914, oh, there's been an assassination in
Mm.
Sarajevo, there might be a war.
I'm reading a very good biography at the moment on Teddy Roosevelt by Edmund Morris, and the inevitability of war is present in that book as well, because
Mm.
I've just finished reading his failed attempt for a third term. There was a loophole because he had risen in his first term after McKinley was assassinated, so he could run for a third term, unlike the
Oh,
current
don't
American,
say don't
unlike the
say
current
that.
American president,
Don't say
who we
that.
won't name. But anyway, he failed just through voters, but he was champing at the bit to be president again because he could see that war was coming, and this was in 1912. So even across the Atlantic, they too knew the inevitability of war, and so I fully understand, and I am ever witnessing and reading cricket documents that, yes, they could tell that this thing was happening, unfortunately. And it really underlines the title of your book, I think, when, in terms of the lights just finally went out. But they had been warned about it for a long time coming. You mentioned there a few of the champions of the tournament for the decade leading up to 1912. In England, were there any people who were doubting the tournament? We know the Australians weren't too keen because they thought it might reduce their pay. Were there any cynics in England at that time leading up to the tournament?
Well, virtually every professional cricketer, yeah,
Mm.
they certainly didn't like it. I can certainly speak for Wilfred Rhodes, but quite a few of the others, they thought it would destroy the county championship
Mm.
because there were going to be 9 Test matches and England were going to have to play 6 times. Um, and it did affect the championship quite badly. Um, I think they would have probably themselves preferred 5 tests against Australia. Um, but I mean, the professional cricketers really just had to suck it up. They like they did in everything else. It was their job to, if they were told to go and play a Test match against South Africa at Trent Bridge, that's where they went. That's what they got paid for. Um, so they had nothing really to say about it. They grumbled, um, probably quite naturally. But the ones who wielded the power certainly were all in
Mm.
favour of it. Really, there might have been, I can't remember. There might have been 1 or 2 exceptions, but I think once Lord Hawke and Lord Harris and people like that got the bit
Yes.
between their teeth, then nobody really was going to gainsay them.
As we mentioned, Fry, who was writing articles left, right, and centre
Yeah.
about it. So he was like the publicist for the tournament. You've already mentioned how this tournament was largely at the backing of Abe Bailey, or Sir Abe, as he became known. Was there ever any other nation or country who could have likely become the third member of this triangular tournament? Because as you pointed out in your book, there were other countries who were possibly exceeding South Africa in terms of their cricketing ability. I mean, we think of the West Indies and America as well. Of course, Philadelphia was a great cricketing stronghold. Canada and New Zealand, possibly even India, were on the rise at that point. So, was it only because A. Bailey was backing them?
Well, certainly those countries were on the well. Actually, the United States was probably on the fall by then,
That's
but
true.
but India was certainly on the rise. But no, I think South Africa had the advantage of being, well, white South Africa had the advantage of being a relatively wealthy country. Um, of course, it
Mm,
had Bailey, but it did have money as well. Um, no, I think South Africa was certainly the third best country by quite a long way. There'd been 1 or 2 Indian touring teams and West Indian touring teams, but I mean, a West Indian touring team was hardly representative of
mm,
the West Indies. It was captained by white players,
mm.
and yeah, no, South Africa were the clear third best, and Bailey's influence was ran right through it.
So let's talk about the tournament itself, and you've touched on it briefly already, just the structure. So there were 9 matches overall, with each country playing 6 each. I believe each match was agreed to be a 3-day test
Hmm.
match, as opposed to what had regularly now been established as 5-day test matches. Um,
No, the in England they were 3-day test
that's true.
matches. That
Sorry, you're right. And in Australia were 5
Australia
days.
Australia were timeless, I think, at that time. Um,
Yes. No, you're right. Yes.
yeah, Australia were timeless. England were 3 days, but there'd always been a system where if the 2 teams were equal coming into the fifth test, they would play that to a finish, which
Mm,
is actually often forgotten because it was never required.
yes.
So yeah, they set them at 3 days. Agreed to play 9 Test matches. I mean, the organisation of the entire thing was very complex. Firstly, whether it would take place, and then how it would take place. And there were various what was it? It was called the Imperial Cricket Council, or the
Mm,
yeah, I think they changed it to no, they changed it to international by then. It went
mm,
from ICC Imperial Cricket Council to International Cricket Council. Very very generous. Um, and yeah, they alighted on that way of doing it. We'll come back to this later. What they didn't do is figure out any rules, but they just figured out, well, we'll play 9 Test matches, and then we'll know who's won.
yeah.
There was an argument over whether the Ashes would actually be at stake because they were only going to play Australia 3 times,
Mm,
and that wasn't a real Ashes series. But they did eventually agree that that would happen. It was just getting the tournament off the ground really seemed to be such an achievement. They didn't really worry about the small print, about how you decide who's won it or not.
mm,
I don't think, to be honest, I don't think anybody really cared who won. What they wanted was to see South Africa and Australia playing in England at the same time, empire unity, budum budum. You know,
yes. Yes.
look at us.
It was a showcase, really, wasn't it? The best
Yeah,
cricketers in the world, or at least from
yeah,
those three entities, on display, as you say, sort of advancing this British ideal. Um, so it makes more sense when we come to consider how halfway through the tournament they start to think, actually, how are we going to crown the winner of this thing? And we're going to touch on that soon. But just back to
we
the
are.
actual structure of the tournament, Patrick, you did mention it before, how it had to slot in sort of between the county tournament
Yeah.
and also all the other first class matches which were routinely played in England. It must have been an absolute logjam on the cricket calendar.
Yeah, yeah, it was. I mean, well, firstly, a logjam for the poor players who came from South Africa and Australia. I mean, there were, I think, 14 were in each of the squads, and they were given a little matter of 40 games each. Um,
Mm,
I mean, they played. Not only did they play 6 Test matches, they played all the counties. A lot of the counties like Yorkshire and Lancashire, where they figure they could get decent crowds, they played them twice. Then they went up to play 2-day games in Scotland or the
mm,
minor counties,
mm,
and these 14 players literally played first class cricket 6 days a week, obviously not on Sunday. Um, from the end of April or beginning of May until halfway through September. And I think someone like Charlie McCartney, Warren Bardsley, who were, I think, played the most, they played something like 42 games, nearly all of them 3-day games.
I think Bardsley played every match on that
Oh,
tournament.
did he? Yeah.
I think
Oh,
so.
well, you're
Yeah.
better informed than I am. Yeah, I did. I did at least remember he was one of the busiest. Okay, he
Mm,
wasn't a bowler, but I mean, for 42 3-day games.
mm.
Um, Not to mention the travelling, of course,
Travel.
because you play a 3-day game, and then unless the Sunday's intervening, you got to travel after the third day, maybe from Northampton to Brighton
Mm,
by train, of course, and then start playing the following morning. Then do that, and you get the Sunday off. Well, absolutely exhausting.
mm.
Um, So not surprising they were sort of pretty knackered when it came towards the end of the tour. But I mean, I suppose the games, in fairness, the games of course weren't as demanding as now. The thing is they weren't required to chase every ball to the boundary.
Well, that's true. And as we'll discover, if listeners don't know already, due to the rain, they probably had quite a few days just sitting around
Yeah,
waiting for the play to begin or resume. So, um,
yeah, they did. Of course, they couldn't know that in advance,
mm,
but yeah, and but that's not to say that particularly the Australian players were cross about this. Quite the contrary, because playing a lot of games was how they made the money, um, and that had always been. I mean, I think it's very important to. Well, I'm sure you were going to get onto it to get on to why Australia had such a terrible time. Um, shall I carry on talking about this, or do you want to
Please do. I mean,
push
we'll
into it?
probably talk about it again at some stage, but would love
Yeah.
to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, Australian tours to Britain had been privately organised. A group of players would get together. Um, Senior players would get together. They'd invite 6 or 7 more players to join their merry band of 13, 14. Then quite often they'd play a couple of games. This group of players would play a couple of games in Australia to get some funds together, and they would sail. Their manager in England would have arranged all the games, and they'd sail off. Totally private enterprise, but representing the country, representing Australia. And 14 of them, they keep it to an absolute minimum. Sometimes they'd have a 15th, young
Hmm.
Victor Trumper. They paid him half money on his first tour,
Mm.
1899, because he was a young gun. Um, and then they would play as much as they could, and they would divvy up the money and pocket their share. And their shares could be, I think the biggest one, they got about £800 each or something, which is
Mm.
an absolute
Huge.
fortune at
Mm.
that time. Um, Now, the Australian Board of Control, when it was finally formed, had a look at this and thought, well, this is where all the money is, test matches. How come we're allowing individual players to pocket all this? Shouldn't we be running this? The MCC had taken over the running of English tours in, I think the first one was 1903-04 to
0304, yeah.
Australia. MCC had taken that over, which of course gave some impetus to the Australian Board of Control, who looked at it and thought, well, shouldn't we be organising the tours? We'll pick the teams, we'll bankroll it, but we'll also take a big share of the profits, and we'll pay the players a flat rate. Um, Funnily enough, the major Australian players didn't really like this, because they could see that they were going to get maybe half of what they'd been getting before. I mean, there was
Mm.
no risk involved, but they'd done a lot of these tours and they'd never lost money.
No.
So they were a bit peeved.
If you're enjoying this podcast, perhaps you'd like to support it by buying me, Tom Ford, a coffee. Every little donation helps with the production costs and also inspire me to keep going. You can support by donating as little as $5. Visit buymeacoffee.com/Golden Age of Cricket. Patrick, let's talk about the triangular tournament and the 3 captains chosen to represent the 3 countries. We've mentioned him already, but let's begin with CB Fry. He's one of those great enigmas, Fry, because you look at his first class record and it's almost unsurpassed. I mean, some of his records still stand today, 6 consecutive first class centuries. I think he scored 94 first class centuries. He was just behind Hayward and Grace in terms of number of centuries when he retired, but he just couldn't quite turn it on in the test arena. 2 test centuries to his name, despite having many attempts. How do you view CB Fry, and do you think he was the right choice to captain England for the 1912 triangular tournament?
Um, well, second question first. He was probably he wasn't really a choice. He was the only potential captain, really, once Warner had got injured. But I'll
Mm.
go back to the first question. Um, Yeah, you could call him a flat track bully, but I would never say that. But his first class career in England was pretty remarkable, but he did play a lot of his cricket at Hove, where
Mm.
um, the wickets tended to be fairly flat, and his run scoring was quite remarkable. I mean, yeah, he was a bit more than a flat track bully. That's certain.
He never came to Australia, which is interesting. Like many of the amateurs, they couldn't sort of I don't know, fund
Couldn't
themselves, or
afford it.
they had other business projects. But if you take the
Yeah.
point as you just made, that he was a flat track bully, he may have actually succeeded well on
Yeah.
the Australian pitches, actually.
Yeah, I think he probably would have done, and it must have been a great regret to him, but he couldn't afford it. He wasn't a rich man. He was pretty reliant on Ranji chucking money
Mm,
at him for
mm.
quite a lot of stuff. Um, I don't know why Ranji never gave him enough to go to Australia. I mean, there were what 3, 4 tours he could have gone on. Yeah, I would have thought he would have prospered in Australia. We'll never know.
It's interesting, just on that point, Patrick. Perhaps Ranji didn't necessarily have the most favourable time in Australia because of the
No.
racism and what he experienced. Perhaps that may have affected the point you made
Yeah,
earlier.
possibly. I mean, the White Australia policy made it pretty uncomfortable for him the one time he did go there. But of course, Fry never would have had that problem. I don't know. Really don't know why Fry never went to Australia, and it is a great shame because that would have really shown what he could and couldn't do. Yeah, it was a real letdown because he was the premier batsman, I suppose, for about 7 or 8 years. He was top of the averages, first class averages, I think 4 or 5 years in a row. Um, and he never really did it in test matches. And I think he was a bit of a difficult chap to get on with as well. But he was immensely talented. Not obviously not just at cricket.
Mm. So on to the Australian team, and the captain chosen was Sid Gregory, who was, I think, 40 at the time. And it's fair to say, had the Big Six drama not occurred, not only would he had not been Australian captain, he wouldn't probably have been on the team at all. Is that fair to say?
I think it's absolutely fair to say he wouldn't have got near the squad. But once Trumper and Armstrong and Ransford had dropped out, they needed some more batsmen. He'd been a very good batsman when he was younger, and he'd been a brilliant fielder. Um, but he was, as you say, in his early 40s. He had precious little captaincy experience, but he was a kind of an older statesman of Australian cricket. So they shoveled him in, made him captain, and
Mm,
sent him off to England. Yeah, it was a complete default captaincy. Um, Obviously, we're going to talk about the big six who didn't go. I
mm,
mean, that's who the big six are: the six players who refused to go because of all the changes within the bureaucracy of Australian cricket. Yeah, he was um, a poor substitute for what it could have been. It obviously would have been Hill, but it could have been Armstrong if Hill hadn't been there. It could have been Trumper. Yeah, there
yeah.
you go.
Gregory's really interesting. He comes from this great pedigree of cricketers. I think he holds the record for the most tours to England. I think he made 8, because his first one, I think, was as a 22-year-old in about 1890. And then he makes one every sort of 3 or 4 years after that, way up to 1912, when he's
Yeah.
sort of the
Well, there were quite a lot of tours in those days because the tours made money, and
exactly.
you couldn't keep them away. They would have come every year if they could.
Must have been a rich man, Sid Gregory. Yes, we should look into his historical bank
Yeah.
accounts, see what came of it. And finally, if we looking at the captains, so Frank Mitchell was the choice for the South Africans, and possibly even considering Sid Gregory, Frank Mitchell was possibly the oddest choice of the three captains. Also in his 40s at the time, and just seemingly plucked out of the air from county cricket. What can you tell us about Frank Mitchell?
Frank Mitchell, he'd been a pretty good batsman for Yorkshire, amateur batsman for Yorkshire at the start of the 20th century. And then he'd gone to South Africa during the Boer War. Um, And funnily enough, because he was a first-class cricketer, he'd met Abe Bailey. And he eventually moved to South Africa as one of Abe Bailey's many secretaries, which basically meant he played for Transvaal and any other team that Bailey wanted him to play for. He was, I'm sure, well rewarded. He's given a decent job. So he was still in South Africa, but as far as I know, I don't think he played first class cricket for about 2 or 3 years. Leading up to the 1912 tournament, South Africa did have a natural captain, their wicketkeeper Percy Sherwell, who was very popular, very good wicketkeeper. Scored a scored a Test century in England on the previous tour. I mean, he would have been a shoo-in as the captain, and he would have probably been the best wicketkeeper in the tournament, or one of the, well, probably the best, or certainly the best wicketkeeper batsman in the tournament. But he decided not to go. So that was one of South Africa's probably one of their most important players, ducked out, and they had to come up with another captain. And I don't know if they offered it to Faulkner, who was their premier player. But anyway, Abe Bailey was a close friend of Mitchell. He obviously, probably not unreasonably, thought, well, Mitchell knows England. He'll be a good representative in terms of functions, making speeches. He's Cambridge educated, I think. You know, good to have one of the old boys who doesn't speak with a South African accent representing us. But he was, in his early 40s. He was overweight. He hadn't played first class cricket for a long time, and that sort of pretty much says everything about the priorities at the time.
Yes, sounds like he was very much a safe choice, which you could almost level at Sid Gregory as well. They knew what they were getting with Sid Gregory. Safe. He'd been through the process before. He wasn't after the big trouble with the big six. They knew they probably didn't want any more drama, even though there subsequently was drama, which again we can talk
Yeah.
about with the Australian party.